Welcome to Hot Air. I am with Diana West, a good friend, a Washington Times columnist, and author of the new book, The Death of the GrownUp: How America's Arrested Development is Bringing Down Western Civilization. Now, you got an interesting mention in the New York Times restaurant roundup.
Yes.
How did The Death of the GrownUp find its way into a restaurant roundup?
Well, I think what it reflects is an understanding in the culture at large that the death of the grown-up is alive and well, if you know what I mean. It was a roundup of all of the new, hot, exciting new restaurants New Yorkers can go to, and had all the big names from the food world, all the big chefs and so on. But the author of the piece said there's one thing that the restaurant world is not offering this season, and it's formality. And she went on to describe a situation where restaurant goers are, spending hundreds of dollars for their food and coming in with their shirts untucked, flip-flops, not Ferragamos, no more linen tablecloths in hotel dining, which of course used to be the bastion of very fine, exciting, glamorous dining. And she tied that right into the theory and called it an extreme version of this theory. Comes from Death of the Grown-Up, which bemoans the fact that adolescents and adults have sort of morphed into a single giant sort of adolescent model in flip-flops, shirts untucked, etc. So it was kind of I found it a vindication of the whole theory, because here it is being seen in the culture at large.
Right. And it goes from New York City restaurants to the White House. You mentioned flip-flops, and remember the incident a couple of years ago where where a bunch of girls from, I think it was a field hockey team or a lacrosse team, had all showed up in flip-flops for a formal picture with the president.
But who told them different? That's the thing. I mean, it's not so much, with the whole theory, it's not so much singling out the individual act so much as noticing that the culture at large is encouraging this and accepting this. So it's hard to blame the kids in the sense, because they're not being schooled that it's actually something that you don't do at the White House or shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned early on in the book, in the introduction, that you've had this position of sort of being above and apart from the culture and being able to see that, and it traces back to a trip that you took to Ireland when you were a kid.
It's very small.
Talk to us about that.
Well, it struck me when it was kind of funny. I was having lunch with my editor at St. Martin's, and I was explaining to him that I think this all went back maybe to a trip I took as a small child. I was 7 or 8 years old, to Ireland. With my family. My father was a writer, a novelist, and he was able to take a year out and decided money would go much farther in Ireland than it would in Los Angeles, where we grew up, which of course, if you live like an American in anywhere, your money doesn't go very far.
Right.
But what the year did was remove me from late 1960s Americana. And I've always felt that on return a year later, I did come back with sort of a stranger's eyes. Now, I think part of that is just kind of a writerly spirit that I think kind of separates many writers from the crowd and makes them observers. But this seemed to encourage that status or placement of me outside the mainstream, where I've kind of stayed ever since, I have to say. But I think on leaving a culture, when you return, you are different. Mm-hmm. And so that was what that anecdote was meant to illustrate, kind of to explain how I could come to have this unusual viewpoint.
The conventional pinpointing of the date of the beginning of the death of the grown-up is the 60s and 70s, or at least that's been the conventional conservative critique. But you place it in the 50s.
Yes, I place it in the conservative halcyon days of the 1950s.
Which is, kind of unconventional. Explain that.
It is. What I discovered, and actually it was not my original observation, I've seen some other historians going into some of this. One of them is Thomas Mintz, whom I cite in the book. But a lot of the liberations, a lot of the loosenings that we do credit the 1960s, or the 1960s generation credits itself with, actually were beginning in the 1950s, whether it was legal changes in segregation laws, Brown v. Board of Education, Rosa Parks riding a bus, the desegregation of University of Mississippi. That was already underway. Other changes, the pill was introduced, I think, by 1960, which was another huge moment. Playboy was launched in the 1950s, so again, we see the sexual liberation beginning. Lenny Bruce had been busted long before the Berkeley free speech movement and was already going through the court system. So that alone, there are other points, but that alone gives you an indication of how much change was actually underway by the end of the 1950s, certainly. Plus, the absolute reorientation of the general culture to youth had already happened. That happened right after World War II. And you see that in the rise of rock and roll, you see that in the rise of a youth market, which had never existed before World War II, products designed expressly for young people, very young people, teenagers, etc. And I think you see that arising because of business responding to a newly wealthy youth market. They had money, they had allowance, they were allowed to keep the money they made in jobs, which before World War II had been the Depression.
Lionel Trilling had a great effect on your work and thinking, and you talk about the concept, the long lost concept of a shaping of a life. Explain that.
I thought that was really fascinating to read, because when he wrote about shaping a life, it was just in the aftermath of student revolutions at Columbia, where he taught for many decades. And, of course he was a brilliant man, but just to be in the midst of change and to see it so clearly, I think is such a credit to his sharpness and intellect. But what he was describing was that he realized that the youth movement was trying to scrap the notion of actually making a life, having a beginning, a middle, and an end, striving to become something. And what the youth movement was talking about and trying to implement was the notion that you never have to become anything. You can just be. You can just become. It's like an endless process, which has its attraction, the idea that you can change yourself, that you can become something else. I mean, I think that there is something very attractive in that notion, that you're not stuck. But I'm not sure that what Trilling was talking about was a hard and fast, cut and dried, you became something and stopped necessarily, at least inside and spiritually and intellectually. However, there was a model that you tended to adhere to, that you needed to become something. And so, the quest was on. And with the youth movement, the quest no longer existed. And I think that the shapelessness that he bemoaned was something that we do live with, and I don't think as a rule it's necessarily a more fulfilling experience for people. So it's a very interesting idea. And there was also the idea that growing up and so on became a limiting experience. Making choices was seen as something retrograde and unpleasant. And so again, it's that same notion, and he compared it, he was a literature professor, and he compared it to great literature. All of great literature, he said, had to do with characters undergoing experiences that made them something. And that's what he saw disappearing.
And we certainly see that the idea of a maturation process is foreign and alien. You see that with, just going back to celebrities, and you look at these old men. you mentioned Mick Jagger, even now, trafficking with teenagers. And you also mentioned Bono, actually, I think there was an FCC case, actually.
There was.
Where he dropped the F word. And
while accepting a great prize, a Grammy or something on TV.
Yeah. And I think the rallying cry was something like, to the audience, keep effing up the mainstream. And there's just something just very symbolic about, the anti-establishment establishment.
Establishment, that's, I think, what people don't like to admit, that the what we used to think of as the counterculture is the mainstream. But the pose of a Bono is that they're still countercultural. And so when he tells his audience to keep effing up the mainstream, there's such a disconnect, because he is the mainstream, so it's all a game, it's all a pose. And it requires them to remain perpetually adolescent, or to think of themselves that way. I think a lot of it is psychological, because obviously, most people are holding down jobs, are raising families, are paying mortgages. So it's not to say or to suggest that there's been a total abdication of all responsibility in the death of the grown-up, but there is still an inclination not to identify with authority and to reject authority, which I think is an immature attitude.
Yeah.
So